Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon and watched the alien ship grow larger on his screen. 3 days ago, his long-range sensors had picked up the massive vessel near the edge of human space, and now they were about to make history. First contact with an alien race would change everything for humanity, and Jake felt the weight of that moment pressing down on his shoulders. The alien ship was beautiful in a cold way. It looked like a crystal made of metal with sharp edges that caught the light from the nearby star. The ship was 10 times bigger than the horizon, and Jake could see weapon ports along its hull. His crew was nervous but excited, and Jake tried to keep his voice steady when he spoke to them. Ambassador Lisa Carter walked onto the bridge wearing her best diplomatic uniform. She had spent her whole career preparing for this moment, and Jake could see both fear and hope in her eyes. Lisa had studied every first contact protocol that Earth had ever written, and she knew that the next few hours would decide whether humanity made a friend or an enemy. The alien ship sent a communication signal, and Jake's communications officer worked quickly to decode it. The message was simple and came through in perfect English, which surprised everyone on the bridge. The aliens had been watching human communications for months and had learned their language. They called themselves the Zelthron Empire, and they wanted to meet with human representatives. Jake ordered his ship to move closer, but kept their weapons powered down. He wanted to show good faith, but he also kept his finger near the emergency alert button. Something about the alien ship made him nervous, even though he could not explain why. The way it moved through space was too perfect and too controlled. The Zelthron leader called himself Admiral Vex Korth, and his voice sounded like metal scraping against stone when it came through the speakers. He spoke politely, but there was something cold in his tone that made Jake uncomfortable. The Admiral invited Lisa and a small team to board his ship for formal negotiations, and Lisa quickly agreed. Jake did not like the idea of letting Lisa go on to the alien ship, but he knew they had to take the risk. He selected his best security team to go with her, including Lieutenant Alex Thompson, who had served with distinction in the outer colonies. Alex was a Marine who had seen combat against pirates and rebels, and Jake trusted him to keep Lisa safe. The transfer went smoothly, and Lisa's team was welcomed aboard the Zelthron ship with great ceremony. The aliens were tall and thin, with pale blue skin and large black eyes. They moved with fluid grace and spoke in voices that sounded like music mixed with static. Their technology was clearly advanced beyond anything humans had seen. Admiral Vex Korth showed Lisa around his ship and explained that the Zelthron Empire controlled hundreds of star systems. He spoke about other alien races that served the Empire and how they had brought peace and order to their corner of the galaxy. Lisa was impressed, but she noticed that the Admiral never mentioned these other races as equals. The negotiations seemed to go well at first. The Zelthrons offered to share some of their technology in exchange for access to human colonies for trade and research. They were particularly interested in the human settlement on Kepler 442b, which had been thriving for 20 years. Lisa thought this sounded reasonable, and she was hopeful about the future. But then Admiral Vex Korth made an unexpected demand. He told Lisa that humans would need to abandon several of their outer colonies because they were in systems that the Zelthron Empire claimed. When Lisa asked why the Empire had not claimed these systems before humans arrived, the Admiral's voice became cold and hard. The Admiral explained that the Zelthron Empire did not see humans as equals. In their view, humans were a young and primitive species that had not earned the right to claim star systems. He said that other alien races had accepted their proper place in the galactic order and that humans should do the same. The Empire would allow humans to keep some of their worlds, but only under Zelthron supervision. Lisa felt her heart sink as she realized that these aliens did not see humans as partners, but as subjects to be controlled. She tried to negotiate, but the Admiral was firm in his demands. When she refused to agree to abandon the colonies, his mood changed completely, and he became threatening. Back on the horizon, Jake watched the alien ship through his sensors and felt increasingly worried. The negotiations had been going on for hours, and he had not heard from Lisa's team. His communications officer reported strange energy readings from the Zelthron ship, and Jake began to suspect that something was going wrong. When Lisa's team finally returned to the horizon, their faces were grim, and Lisa looked shaken. She explained what had happened, and Jake felt anger building inside him as he listened. The Zelthrons had given humanity an ultimatum: abandon the outer colonies within 1 week or face the consequences. Jake knew that the human colonies would never agree to abandon their homes. These people had spent years building new lives on distant worlds, and they would fight rather than give up everything they had worked for. As he looked at the Zelthron ship on his screen, Jake realized that humanity was about to face its first interstellar war, and he wondered if they would survive it. The Zelthron attack on Kepler 442b came exactly 1 week after the failed negotiations. Admiral Vex Korth had promised to demonstrate Zelthron power, and he kept his word in the worst possible way. From orbit above the human colony, his ships released a biological weapon that spread through the atmosphere like invisible death. Dr. Helen Roberts was in her medical lab when the first colonists started dying. She had been the chief medical officer on Kepler 442b for 8 years and had seen everything from broken bones to radiation poisoning, but nothing had prepared her for this. The victims came in gasping for air, with their skin turning blue and their bodies shutting down one system at a time. The weapon was designed to target human biology specifically, and it worked with terrible efficiency. Within the first day, thousands of colonists were dead, and Helen watched helplessly as her medical equipment failed to save them. The Zelthron pathogen attacked the human nervous system and immune response simultaneously, making treatment almost impossible. Lieutenant Alex Thompson had been stationed on Kepler 442b to help with the evacuation, but there was nowhere to evacuate. 2. The biological weapon had spread across the entire planet, and the few ships available could not carry everyone to safety. Alex organized the survivors into groups and tried to maintain order as panic spread through the colony. The death toll climbed rapidly, and Helen began to think that humanity was facing extinction. The Zelthron weapon was unlike anything in human medical databases, and she had no idea how to fight it. She worked around the clock trying different treatments, but nothing seemed to slow the pathogen's advance. Then something unexpected happened. On the 3rd day after the attack, Helen noticed that some colonists were not dying. At first, she thought they were just taking longer to succumb to the weapon, but careful observation showed that these survivors were actually fighting off the infection. Their bodies were adapting to the pathogen faster than any disease response she had ever seen. Ben Walsh was one of the survivors, and Helen studied his blood samples with growing amazement. Ben was the settlement coordinator and had lived on Kepler 442b longer than almost anyone else. His immune system was not just resisting the Zelthron weapon, but was actually learning to counteract it. Helen found antibodies in his blood that had not existed before the attack. The pattern repeated across the colony as more survivors emerged from the initial die-off. These people were not randomly lucky, but shared certain genetic traits that seemed to provide resistance to the alien weapon. Helen realized that human genetic diversity was working as a natural defense against the Zelthron attack. Alex Thompson was amazed by what he saw among the survivors. These people had watched their friends and family die, but instead of giving up, they had rolled up their sleeves and gotten back to work. They buried their dead and then immediately started rebuilding their damaged facilities. The Zelthrons had expected the survivors to flee in terror, but instead they were digging in deeper. Word of the attack spread quickly through human space, and the response was not what the Zelthrons had anticipated. Instead of abandoning the outer colonies, human settlers began fortifying their positions and preparing for war. Captain Jake Morrison received orders to evacuate the remaining colonies, but when he arrived at each settlement, he found the same thing: colonists who refused to leave. The settlers had spent generations building their homes on distant worlds, and they were not going to abandon everything because aliens told them to. They had faced asteroid storms, equipment failures, food shortages, and isolation, but they had never given up. Now they faced an alien empire that wanted to drive them away, and their response was the same stubborn determination that had carried them across the stars. Helen continued her research into the survivors and made discoveries that excited and terrified her at the same time. The humans who had survived the biological attack were not just immune to that specific weapon, but were developing broader resistances. Their bodies were adapting at a rate that should have been impossible according to everything she knew about human biology. The children who survived the attack showed even more dramatic changes. Helen found that kids who had been exposed to the Zelthran weapon were developing new proteins in their blood and enhanced immune responses. It was as if humanity was evolving in real time under the pressure of alien attack. Admiral Vex Korth was frustrated by the human response to his demonstration of power. He had expected the biological weapon to kill most humans and drive the survivors away from Zelthran space. Instead, he found human colonies that were more determined than ever to resist. The Admiral decided that he needed to escalate his attacks to show these primitive creatures their proper place. The second wave of attacks came 2 weeks later and targeted human infrastructure. Zelthran ships used energy weapons to destroy power plants, communication arrays, and transportation hubs. The aliens expected this to break human morale and force them to surrender, but once again the humans surprised them. Instead of surrendering, the colonists adapted to life without their destroyed infrastructure. They rigged backup power systems from salvaged parts and created new communication networks using equipment that should not have worked. Alex Thompson watched farmers use broken mining equipment to dig shelter tunnels and saw engineers jury-rig life support systems from spare parts. Helen documented case after case of humans surviving conditions that should have killed them. Colonists were living in damaged habitats with reduced oxygen and increased radiation, but they were not just surviving but thriving. She began to suspect that humans possessed something that other species lacked: an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Zelthrons had conquered dozens of alien species over the centuries, and they always followed the same pattern. First came the demonstration of power, then the infrastructure attacks, and finally the survivors would surrender and accept their place in the empire. But humans were not following this pattern, and Admiral Vex Korth began to realize that he was dealing with something unprecedented. The war was just beginning, but already the Zelthrons were learning something important about humanity. These creatures did not think like other species, and they did not respond to threats the way civilized beings should. When faced with extinction, humans did not calculate odds or seek compromise. They simply refused to die, and that refusal was backed up by a determination that bordered on madness. The war spread across human space like wildfire as Admiral Vex Korth committed more Zelthran fleets to what he now called the human problem. 6 months after the first attack on Kepler 442b, dozens of human colonies were under siege, and the death toll had reached into the billions. But instead of breaking human resistance, each attack seemed to make them more determined to fight. General Patricia Lewis commanded Earth's defense forces from a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. She had been a career military officer, but nothing in her training had prepared her for fighting an enemy with such overwhelming technological superiority. The Zelthrons had weapons that could crack planets and shields that deflected humanity's most powerful missiles. Traditional military strategy said that humans should surrender to preserve what lives they could, but Patricia had learned something important about her species. They did not think traditionally. The reports coming in from the outer colonies told a story that defied military logic. Human settlements that should have been wiped out after the first attack were still fighting weeks later. Colonists were using farming equipment as weapons and turning their own infrastructure into traps for Zelthron ground forces. They were not just dying for their homes, but finding ways to take enemies with them when they fell. Marcus King was an engineer working in one of Earth's secret research facilities, and he had been tasked with reverse engineering captured Zelthran technology. The alien equipment was centuries ahead of human science, but Marcus approached it with the same stubborn determination that characterized his species. Where Zelthran engineers had built elegant and efficient systems, Marcus created crude but effective copies using human materials and manufacturing techniques. The cost of this research was enormous, and Marcus watched his team push themselves beyond human limits to crack alien secrets. They worked 18-hour days in radiation-flooded labs, and several engineers had already died from exposure to exotic particles. But every breakthrough brought humanity one step closer to being able to fight back against their technologically superior enemies. Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted to admiral after his ship became one of the first to successfully capture a Zelthran vessel. The battle had been brutal, and Morrison had lost most of his crew, but they had managed to disable the alien ship through a ramming attack that should have destroyed both vessels. The fact that the Horizon had survived the collision was pure luck, but it gave humanity its first intact sample of Zelthran technology. The captured ship revealed the true scope of the Zelthran Empire, and the news was terrifying. The Empire controlled thousands of star systems and had access to resources that dwarfed anything humanity could imagine. Their military was vast and experienced, and they had never lost a war against another species. The logical response would have been for humanity to negotiate surrender, but logic had never been humanity's strongest trait. Dr. Helen Roberts had relocated her research to a hidden facility on Europa after Kepler 442b was finally abandoned. The colony had held out for 3 months against constant Zelthran attacks before the survivors were forced to evacuate. But those 3 months had given Helen invaluable data about human adaptation under extreme stress, and her findings would change how humanity approached the war. The survivors from Kepler 442b were different from baseline humans in ways that Helen was still trying to understand. They were stronger, faster, and more resilient than their pre-war selves. More importantly, they seemed to have developed an enhanced ability to learn and adapt to new threats. Helen suspected that humanity was undergoing rapid evolution in response to the Zelthran attacks. The children born during the war showed even more dramatic changes, and Helen documented abilities that bordered on superhuman. Kids who had been exposed to Zelthran weapons in utero could survive radiation levels that would kill normal humans. Some showed enhanced reflexes and cognitive abilities that suggested their brains were developing differently than previous generations. Lieutenant Alex Thompson had been assigned to train these war-born children for combat, and he was amazed by what he saw. These kids learned weapons handling and tactical thinking faster than veteran soldiers, and they showed no fear of Zelthran technology. Where older humans might hesitate when facing alien weapons, these children adapted instantly to new threats. The Zelthrons were growing frustrated with human resistance, and Admiral Vex Korth authorized the use of increasingly deadly weapons. Radiation bombs that could sterilize entire continents, gravity weapons that could crush cities, and neural disruptors that could shut down human brain function were deployed against the stubborn colonists. Each weapon was designed to exploit what the Zelthrans saw as human weaknesses, but humanity kept finding ways to survive. The breakthrough came when Marcus King successfully reverse-engineered a Zelthran shield generator. The human version was crude and inefficient compared to the original, but it could deflect energy weapons long enough for human ships to close to combat range. Combined with humanity's willingness to use kamikaze attacks, this gave human fleets their first real chance to hurt Zelthran forces. Admiral Morrison led the first successful human counterattack against a Zelthran fleet near the Tau Ceti system. His ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but they used tactics that no sane species would attempt. Human vessels rammed Zelthran ships, detonated their own reactors to damage enemy vessels, and continued fighting even after taking catastrophic damage. The battle was a slaughter for both sides, but humanity achieved something that had seemed impossible. They hurt the Zelthrans. The psychological impact of the victory was enormous, and news of the successful attack spread through human space like electricity. For the first time since the war began, humans believed they might actually be able to fight back against the Empire. Recruitment for the military increased dramatically as people volunteered for missions that were essentially suicide runs. Dr. Helen Roberts published her research on human adaptation, and the findings were distributed to every human settlement. Her work showed that humanity possessed a unique ability to evolve under pressure, and that each generation of war survivors was stronger than the last. The research also revealed something that terrified and inspired humans in equal measure. They were becoming something new. The Zelthrons began to realize that they were not fighting a normal war, but something unprecedented in galactic history. Other species had fought the Empire and lost, but they had followed predictable patterns of resistance and eventual surrender. Humans did not seem to understand that they were supposed to lose, and their refusal to accept defeat was reshaping them into something that had never existed before. General Patricia Lewis received reports that human colonies were not just surviving Zelthran attacks, but were beginning to thrive under the pressure. Settlements that had been reduced to ruins were rebuilding stronger than before, and colonists were developing new technologies born from desperation and determination. The war was changing humanity in ways that no one had expected, and Patricia began to wonder what her species would become if they survived the conflict. 3 years into the war, humanity had lost dozens of worlds and billions of lives, but something extraordinary was happening to the survivors. The children born during the conflict were not just different from their parents, but represented a new phase of human evolution. Combat medic Frank Chen documented these changes as he moved between battlefields and refugee camps across human space. Frank had seen humans survive injuries that should have been fatal and recover from wounds that would have crippled earlier generations. The war-born children showed resistance to radiation, enhanced healing abilities, and reflexes that seemed almost superhuman. Most remarkably, they displayed an intuitive understanding of Zelthron technology that allowed them to operate captured, alien equipment with minimal training. The Zelthron Empire was growing increasingly frustrated with the human resistance, and Admiral Vex Korth had become obsessed with what he called the human anomaly. Every weapon deployed against humanity seemed to make them stronger rather than weaker. The Admiral had authorized the use of planet-killer weapons on 3 human worlds, but even as entire planets burned, human refugees scattered across space, carrying their knowledge and adaptations with them. Dr. Helen Roberts worked from a mobile laboratory aboard one of the refugee fleets, and her research had taken on desperate urgency. She had documented rapid genetic changes in human populations, exposed to Zelthran weapons, and found that each generation was developing new resistances. The children born to survivors of biological attacks showed immunity to multiple pathogens, while those exposed to energy weapons displayed enhanced cellular repair mechanisms. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded the largest human fleet still in operation, and he had learned to use humanity's greatest strength, their unpredictability. Where other species fought according to established military doctrine, humans constantly improvised new tactics that confused and frustrated their enemies. His ships used everything from ramming attacks to weaponized mining equipment in battles that followed no rational pattern. The most successful human operations were led by Commander Kate Phillips, who had developed a new form of warfare behind enemy lines. Her teams specialized in capturing Zelthran ships and turning their own technology against them. The aliens had built their vessels to be operated by logical and disciplined crews, but Kate's people approached alien systems with human creativity and adaptability. Kate's teams discovered that Zelthran AI systems could be confused by human thought patterns that did not follow predictable logical sequences. Where alien crews would input commands in specific order, humans would try random combinations until something worked. This chaotic approach allowed them to hack Zelthron computers and reprogram their weapon systems to target their own ships. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical battles, and humans had learned to exploit Zelthran expectations. The Empire had conquered other species by demonstrating overwhelming power and then accepting surrender, but humans refused to follow this script. When faced with certain death, they would find ways to take enemies with them that defied all military. Logic Frank Chen had been present at the Battle of Wolf 359, where human forces had turned a devastating defeat into a Pyrrhic victory for the Zelthrons. The human fleet had been surrounded and outgunned, but instead of surrendering, they had detonated their own ship's reactors in coordinated explosions that crippled the attacking fleet. The humans died, but they took twice as many enemies with them. War was changing both sides, but the changes in humanity were more dramatic and disturbing to outside observers. Zelthron intelligence reports described humans as a species that had abandoned self-preservation in favor of species preservation. Individual humans would sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it gave their species even a small advantage in the long-term struggle. Dr. Helen Roberts had developed what she called the Lazarus Protocol, based on her studies of human adaptation during the war. The process involved controlled exposure to various Zelthran weapons under medical supervision and resulted in enhanced resistance to alien technology. The volunteers for these experiments knew they might die, but they lined up anyway because the alternative was extinction for their entire species. Marcus King's daughter Rachel represented the new generation of war-born humans, and she had joined the military as soon as she came of age. Rachel was stronger and faster than her father's generation and possessed an intuitive understanding of technology that allowed her to repair complex systems with minimal training. She could operate in environments that would kill normal humans and recover from injuries that should have been permanent. The Zelthrons were beginning to fear human unpredictability as much as their persistence, and Admiral Vex Korth had started having nightmares about human tactics. His intelligence officers reported that humans were using their own children as weapons by training them to operate in conditions that would kill adult aliens. The Empire had never faced an enemy that would sacrifice their young for strategic advantage. Commander Kate Phillips led a daring raid on a Zelthran research station that revealed the Empire's growing desperation. The facility was developing new weapons specifically designed to counter human adaptability, but the research showed that the aliens were struggling to keep up with human evolution. Each new weapon was quickly countered by human biology or ingenuity. The raid also revealed that other alien species in the Empire were watching the human war with growing interest and concern. Intelligence reports showed that several subject races were beginning to question Zelthran authority, and some were secretly supporting human resistance efforts. The Empire's reputation for invincibility was cracking under the pressure of human stubbornness. Frank Chen documented the emergence of what he called the Phoenix generation among human children born in the later years of the war. These kids showed abilities that bordered on supernatural, including enhanced cognitive abilities, improved physical coordination, and most remarkably, an apparent immunity to fear when facing Zelthran technology. They approached alien weapons with the same curiosity that earlier generations had shown toward new toys. Admiral Morrison realized that humanity was fighting for more than just survival, but for the right to exist as an independent species in the galaxy. The Zelthrans had offered conditional surrender multiple times, but each offer required humans to accept permanent subservience to the Empire. The human response had been consistent. They would rather face extinction than accept slavery. The HFY War entered its fourth year with no end in sight, and both sides had been fundamentally changed by the conflict. The Zelthrons had suffered losses that they had never experienced before, and were beginning to question their own superiority. Humans had evolved into something that no longer resembled their pre-war selves and showed no signs of stopping their adaptation to the pressures of interstellar warfare. Dr. Helen Roberts published her final research paper on human evolution during wartime, and the conclusions were both inspiring and terrifying. Humanity was becoming something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that treated extinction as just another engineering problem to be solved through determination and sacrifice. The question was no longer whether humans could survive the war, but what they would become if they won it. By the 5th year of the war, the tide had begun to turn in ways that defied every prediction made by Zelthran strategists. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded fleets of ships that existed only because humanity had refused to accept the logical outcome of their conflict with the Empire. His vessels were jury-rigged combinations of human engineering and captured alien technology that should not have worked, but somehow did. The human fleets used tactics that no sane species would attempt, and Morrison had become a master of organized chaos. His ships would jump into battle against overwhelming odds and immediately begin ramming attacks while simultaneously launching boarding parties and setting off reactor overloads. The Zelthrons had superior technology, but they could not predict what humans would do next because humans themselves often did not know until the moment came. Commander Kate Phillips had been promoted to admiral after her guerrilla campaigns behind. Enemy lines had crippled 3 Zelthran task forces. Her specialty was turning alien technology against its creators, and she had perfected the art of capturing enemy ships through methods that bordered on insanity. Her crews would board Zelthron vessels while they were still fighting and reprogram their systems in the middle of battle. Kate's success came from understanding something that the Zelthrons had missed about human psychology. Where other species would retreat when faced with impossible odds, humans would often become more creative and dangerous. Her teams performed best when they were trapped with no way out, because that was when human ingenuity reached its peak. The war-born generation had come of age, and Rachel King represented everything that humanity had become under the pressure of interstellar conflict. She was faster, stronger, and more resilient than her parents' generation. But more importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of both human and alien technology that allowed her to bridge the gap between the two. Rachel commanded her own ship at the age of 22, and her crew was entirely composed of war-born humans who had never known peace. They could operate in vacuum without suits for short periods, survive radiation that would kill normal humans, and repair complex systems using nothing but spare parts and determination. Most remarkably, they showed no fear of death because they had been raised to see their own lives as secondary to species survival. Dr. Helen Roberts had aged rapidly during the war years, but her research had unlocked secrets of human adaptation that would reshape the species forever. Her Lazarus protocol had been refined through 5 years of desperate experimentation, and the results were beyond anything she had imagined when the war began. Humans were not just adapting to Zelthran weapons, but were developing abilities that seemed to violate known laws of biology. The latest generation of children showed enhancements that bordered on science fiction, and Helen documented cases of accelerated healing, enhanced cognitive abilities, and most remarkably, a form of technological intuition that allowed them to understand complex systems through touch alone. These children could operate alien equipment without training and seemed to instinctively know how to repair damaged technology. Frank Chen had been promoted to Chief Medical Officer for the Human Resistance, and his battlefield reports painted a picture of a species that had transcended its original limitations. He documented soldiers who continued fighting after sustaining injuries that should have been fatal, and civilians who rebuilt their destroyed settlements using materials that should not have been sufficient for the task. The Zelthran Empire was fracturing under the pressure of the human war, and Admiral Vex Korth faced rebellion from within his own ranks. Several alien species that had served the Empire for centuries were beginning to question Zelthran authority, and some had secretly begun providing intelligence to human forces. The Empire's reputation for invincibility had been shattered by a species that simply refused to acknowledge their own defeat. Intelligence reports revealed that the Zelthrons were developing increasingly desperate weapons designed specifically to counter human adaptability. These included devices that targeted human DNA directly, weapons that attacked the human nervous system, and even experimental technology that attempted to disrupt human creativity and problem-solving abilities. Each new weapon was quickly countered. By human evolution or ingenuity, Admiral Morrison led the most ambitious human operation of the war when his fleets launched a coordinated attack on the Zelthran home system itself. The assault was militarily insane as it required human forces to penetrate the most heavily defended region of space in the known galaxy. The logical outcome should have been the complete destruction of the human fleets, but logic had never been humanity's strong point. The battle above the Zelthran homeworld lasted for 3 days and became known as the Crucible among human survivors. Morrison's ships were outnumbered 50-1 and faced weapons that could destroy planets, but they pressed their attack with the same stubborn determination that had carried humanity through 5 years of impossible war. Rachel King commanded. One of the assault wings and her ship was among the first to penetrate the inner defense perimeter around the Zelthran homeworld. Her crew used their enhanced abilities to operate in conditions that would have killed normal humans, and they successfully disabled several orbital defense platforms through boarding actions that defied military logic. The turning point came when Kate Phillips led a desperate assault on Admiral Vex Korth's flagship. Her boarding party fought through the ship's corridors while it was still engaged in battle and reached the command deck just as the Admiral was preparing to use a planet killer weapon against the attacking human fleet. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brutal, but the humans prevailed through sheer determination. Dr. Helen Roberts monitored the battle from the medical ships and watched as her life's work was validated in the most dramatic way possible. The humans fighting above the Zelthran homeworld were no longer the same species that had first encountered the Empire 5 years earlier. They had evolved into something new and unprecedented that treated impossible odds as merely another challenge to overcome. The aftermath of the battle sent shockwaves through the galaxy as news spread that humanity had not only survived the Zelthran assault but had actually defeated the Empire's main fleet. Other alien species that had served the Zelthrans for millennia began to openly rebel, and the Empire found itself facing uprisings across dozens of star systems. Frank Chen's medical reports from the battle showed the full extent of human transformation during the war years. Soldiers who had been critically wounded continued fighting until their objectives were achieved, and then died with expressions of satisfaction on their faces. Civilians who had lost everything continued working to support the war effort because they saw their individual sacrifice as part of a larger purpose. The victory above the Zelthran homeworld proved that humanity had become something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species that simply could not be broken. They had faced extinction and responded by evolving into something stronger. They had been offered surrender and chosen death instead. Most remarkably, they had taken the worst that the galaxy could throw at them and emerged victorious through nothing more than their refusal to accept defeat. The final battle above the Zelthran homeworld had lasted 3 days, but its outcome would reshape the galaxy for generations to come. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched as the last Zelthran defense platforms fell silent. His fleet had paid a terrible price for this victory, but they had achieved something that every military analyst had declared impossible. They had broken the Zelthran Empire through sheer force of will. The human ships that survived the battle were barely recognizable as the vessels that had begun the assault. They were held together by emergency repairs and jury-rigged systems that should not have worked but somehow did. Many ships had lost more than half their crew, but the survivors continued to operate them through determination and the enhanced abilities that 5 years of war had given humanity. Admiral Vex Korth's flagship was burning and drifting powerless through space after Kate Phillips and her boarding party had fought their way to the command deck. The Zelthran admiral lay dying from wounds received in hand-to-hand combat with humans who had proven stronger and more resilient than his species had believed possible. With his last breath, he transmitted a message that would echo across the galaxy. The Admiral's final words were broadcast on all frequencies and reached every corner of known space within hours. His voice was weak, but filled with a mixture of respect and terror as he spoke about the species that had defeated his empire. He warned other alien races to fear humanity, not because they were the strongest or smartest, but because they simply would not quit no matter what obstacles they faced. The message described humans as a species that treated their own destruction as unacceptable and would sacrifice everything to prevent extinction. Vexcorth spoke of watching human children volunteer for suicide missions and seeing human civilians rebuild their destroyed homes with their bare hands. Most chilling of all, he described humans who smiled as they died because they knew their sacrifice would help their species survive. Rachel King had been among the boarding party that captured the Zelthron flagship, and she now stood in the enemy command center looking at displays that showed the collapse of an empire that had ruled hundreds of star systems for thousands of years. At 23 years old, she represented the future of humanity, stronger, faster, and more resilient than any human who had lived before the war. The war-born generation had never known peace, but they had been shaped by conflict into something unprecedented in galactic history. They could survive in environments that would kill their grandparents and operate technology that should have been beyond human understanding. Most importantly, they possessed an absolute certainty that humanity would prevail over any challenge, because they had proven it could be done. Dr. Helen Roberts received reports from across human space as news of the victory spread, and the results filled her with both pride and concern. The humans celebrating in the streets were no longer the same species that had first encountered the Zelthrons 6 years earlier. They had evolved under pressure into something new, and the question now was what role this transformed humanity would play in galactic civilization. Her research showed that the changes were permanent and would be passed on to future generations. The enhanced physical abilities, technological intuition, and psychological resilience that humans had developed during the war were now part of their genetic heritage. Humanity had not just survived the conflict, but had been fundamentally transformed by it. Frank Chen worked in the medical bays treating wounded soldiers from the final battle and marveled at their recovery rates. Men and women who should have died from their injuries were already asking when they could return to duty. Their enhanced healing abilities meant that wounds that would have been crippling to earlier generations were merely temporary inconveniences. The victory celebrations were subdued because humans had learned during the war that survival was more important than glory. The price of defeating the Zelthron Empire had been enormous, and every human family had lost someone to the conflict. But they had achieved something that would echo through history. They had proven that their species could not be broken by any force in the universe. Admiral Morrison received surrender offers from Zelthron forces across the galaxy as news of their defeat spread through alien communication networks. The empire that had seemed invincible just days earlier was crumbling as subject species rose in rebellion and Zelthron commanders abandoned their posts. The humans had not just won a battle, but had shattered the myth of Zelthron superiority. The other alien species in the galaxy watched these events with a mixture of awe and terror as they realized what humanity had become. Intelligence reports described humans as a species that had abandoned normal concepts of self-preservation in favor of species-level survival strategies. They would sacrifice individuals without hesitation if it gave their race even a small advantage. Kate Phillips was promoted to admiral and tasked with establishing human authority in the former Zelthron territories. Her reputation for turning impossible situations into victories made her the perfect choice for this role, but she knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Humanity now controlled more star systems than they had ever dreamed of, but they would need to learn how to govern other species. The transition from desperate survivors to galactic power happened almost overnight, and many humans struggled to adjust to their new role. They had spent years fighting for their very existence, and now found themselves responsible for the welfare of dozens of alien species who had served the Zelthron Empire. The challenge was learning to rule without becoming the tyrants they had. Defeated, Dr. Helen Roberts published her final research on human evolution during the war, and the conclusions would influence galactic policy for centuries. Her work showed that humanity possessed unique psychological traits that made them impossible to conquer through conventional means. When faced with extinction, they did not calculate odds or seek compromise, but simply refused to accept defeat. The research also revealed that humans became more dangerous as the threats against them increased. Where other species would eventually break under pressure, humans would continue adapting and evolving until they found a way to overcome any challenge. This made them potentially the most dangerous species in the galaxy if they were ever threatened with extinction again. Rachel King stood on the observation deck of humanity's newest exploration vessel and looked out at the star fields that now belonged to human space. Behind her lay a trail of worlds where humans had refused to die, and ahead lay a galaxy that was still learning what it meant to face a species that treated extinction as just another engineering problem to be solved. The war was over, but its legacy would shape the future of galactic civilization. Humanity had proven that they could not be conquered, enslaved, or destroyed by any force in the universe. They had paid an enormous price for this knowledge, but they had emerged from the conflict as something unprecedented, a species that had looked extinction in the face and laughed. The galaxy would remember the lesson of the human war for millennia to come. There were many species that could be reasoned with, traded with, or even conquered if necessary. But there was only one species that simply refused to die, no matter what challenges they faced. The humans had earned their place among the stars through determination and sacrifice, and they would never give it up.